The finality of it was not in the judge's gavel or the rustle of the deed her son, Thomas, held with such casual ownership. It was in the solid click of her own front door, closing behind her for the last time. Elspeth stood on the porch of the house she had shared with her husband for 47 years, a house where she had raised that same son, and felt the chill of the late autumn air not on her skin, but deep inside her bones. She was 71 years old and she was homeless. Thomas and his wife, Clara, had been methodical. They used words like concern and oversight, claiming she was no longer fit to manage her own affairs. Sheriff Gable, a man who had eaten at her table as a boy, stood by with a look of practiced pity, ensuring the transition was smooth and legal. It was a quiet, respectable execution of a life. They hadn't thrown her into the street with shouting and anger. They had done it with paperwork and regretful smiles, which was somehow colder. Clara pressed a small, worn leather pouch into her hand. "For your needs, Mother Elspeth," she'd said, her voice a careful blend of charity and dismissal. Inside were $12. Beside her on the porch sat a small wooden box containing her late husband's best hand tools, a fine saw, a heavy hammer, a set of chisels, an auger. She wore her thickest wool coat. That was the sum of her worldly possessions, except for two other things. One was the deed to a piece of land everyone in the town of Providence called Hewitt's Folly. Her husband had bought it decades ago in a fit of misguided optimism, an abandoned limestone quarry miles out in the granite foothills. It was considered less than worthless. It was a hazard. The other thing she had left was Barrow, her husband's old hound, whose grizzled muzzle now pushed gently into her cold hand. The dog whined softly, looking from her face to the closed door, not understanding why they were on the wrong side of it. He was all that remained of a warmer world. The whispers followed her as she walked toward the mercantile. Pity from some, a sharp tang of satisfaction from others. She was a loose end, a problem now neatly solved. Mr. Finch, behind the counter of his store, polished a glass jar and avoided her gaze. He had known her since he was in knee pants. "Headed east, Elspeth?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To your sister in the capital?" "My sister passed 4 years ago, Henry," she replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her soul. He had the decency to look ashamed. "Of course, the poorhouse then. It's clean. Decent folk run it." Elspeth looked at the $12 in her palm. It was enough for a ticket east, or a few weeks of charity, or it was enough for something else. "I'll need a good felling axe," she said, her voice clear and hard as riverstone. "And a shovel, 20 pounds of salt, and a sack of winter rye. And your best spade." Finch stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He started to speak, to argue, to offer the same sensible advice everyone else had. But he saw something in the old woman's eyes, not wildness, not despair, but a kind of compressed, unyielding force. He turned and silently gathered the items. The bill came to $11.50. She was left with 2 quarters. She did not look back at the town of Providence. With Barrow trotting faithfully at her side, she hefted the axe and shovel over one shoulder, the heavy sack over the other, and turned her face toward the cold gray hills. She walked away from the life that had been taken from her, and toward the worthless land that was all she had left. The journey was a punishment. Each step was a reminder of her 71 years, of joints that ached and muscles that had long ago settled into the soft rhythms of town life. The road dwindled to a track, and the track dissolved into a game trail winding through skeletal aspen and stubborn pine. The weight of the salt and seed sack dug into her shoulder, a constant grinding pain. The axe handle, new and smooth, felt alien and heavy in her hand. Barrow stayed close, his presence a silent, comforting weight against her leg whenever she paused. The sun was a pale wafer in a sky the color of dishwater. The wind had teeth, biting at her cheeks, and finding the gaps in her worn coat. She was not just walking into the wilderness, she was walking off the edge of the map of her own life. The town, with its warm lights and cruel whispers, was gone behind her. Ahead was only the rising, indifferent stone of the foothills. She reached the quarry as the light began to fail, the world turning to shades of charcoal and deep violet. And the sight of it stole the last of her breath. It was worse than she had imagined, worse than the town gossip had ever described. It was a wound in the earth, a great gaping pit of white rock and gray shadow. Sheer cliffs dropped 100 feet to a floor of shattered limestone and rubble. At the bottom, a pool of black stagnant water reflected the dying sky. The wind, funneled by the high walls, howled through the chasm with a lonely, mournful sound. This was her inheritance, a hole, a barren, wind-swept pit of rock. For a long, terrible moment, Elspeth stood on the precipice and believed the town was right. Thomas was right, Clara was right. She was a foolish old woman, and this was her grave. A wave of despair so profound it was physical washed over her. Her knees felt weak, her lungs tight. The cold was no longer just in the air. It was inside her, a block of ice where her hope had been. Barrow whined, sensing her anguish, and leaned his heavy body against her. She sank to her knees, the sharp edges of the gravel digging into her old bones, and for the first time since the door had clicked shut, she nearly wept. But the tears would not come. They were frozen solid by a lifetime of quiet endurance. Instead, a grim resolve settled in their place. She had 2 quarters, a dog, and a hole in the ground. Crying would not make her warm. Dying here on the edge of the pit would only prove them right. Slowly, stiffly, she got to her feet. She would not give them the satisfaction. She worked her way down a treacherous scree slope, a path once used by quarry carts, to the floor of the pit. Down here, the world changed. The howling wind that raked the cliff tops was gone, replaced by an unnerving, profound stillness. The air was colder, heavier, but it was still. She walked along the base of the tallest cliff, a sheer wall of pale limestone that faced south. She ran a bare, wrinkled hand over its surface. The rock was cold, of course, but it was a dry, solid cold. It felt different from the damp, biting chill of the air. It held a phantom memory of the day's meager sunlight. It was a wall against the world. Following the base of the cliff, she found a place where the rock curved inward, forming a shallow alcove perhaps 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep. It wasn't a cave, more of a deep scallop carved out by the ancient quarrymen. It offered a natural roof of solid stone overhead. As she explored the back of this recess, her fingers brushed against something damp. She looked closer. From a tiny, almost invisible fissure in the limestone, a single drop of water emerged, glittered for a moment, and fell. It was followed by another and another, a slow but perfectly steady seep of clean, clear water trickling down the rock face. Still air, a shield from the wind, a solid roof, and water. Elspeth stood in the deepening gloom and felt the first flicker of something that was not despair. The quarry was not just a hole, it was a foundation. The town saw a worthless pit. She was beginning to see the shape of a house. The town was wrong. The work began at dawn the next day, and it was a brutal education. Every muscle in her 71-year-old body screamed in protest. Her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were soft. By noon on the first day they were raw. By dusk they were blistered. By the end of the week the blisters had broken, bled, and begun to form a second skin of hard callus. The labor was relentless, a punishing rhythm of lifting, hauling, and stacking that pushed her to the edge of collapse every single day. Her first task was to clear the floor of the alcove. It was littered with decades of fallen rock and debris. She used the shovel and her bare hands, moving stones one by one, creating a level, livable space. She worked until her back was a single, solid knot of pain, until the sweat stung her eyes and her breath came in ragged gasps. At night, she would collapse under a makeshift lean-to of fallen branches, huddled with barrow for warmth, her body throbbing with an exhaustion so deep it felt like its own kind of numbness. She ate sparingly from a small bag of dried meat and hardtack she'd brought, saving her strength. Once the space was clear, she began to build. The front of the alcove needed a wall, a barrier against the cold that would soon descend. The surrounding hills were dotted with pines killed by beetle blight, their wood dry and seasoned. Using the felling axe, she learned the geometry of a good swing, the way to let the tool's weight do the work. The first tree she felled took her half a day, and fell the wrong way, its branches tangling in another tree. The second was better. By the 10th, she understood the bite of the blade, the whisper of the wood, just before it gave way. Getting the logs down into the quarry was another trial. She could not carry them. Instead, she pushed and levered them to the quarry's edge and sent them crashing down the scree slope, a dangerous, thunderous process that left her heart pounding. Then came the work of hauling them into place, using smaller logs as rollers, her muscles straining, her teeth gritted. She was building not with skill, but with sheer, stubborn refusal to fail. For the mortar, she used the quarry itself. Her husband had been a reader, and he'd once read to her about how the old-timers made lime mortar. She gathered chunks of limestone, built a raging fire in a protected pit, and cooked the rock until it crumbled into a fine white powder. Near the seep she found a deposit of thick gray clay. She mixed the lime powder, the clay, and sand from the quarry floor, adding water from the seep until she had a thick, sticky paste. It was crude, but it would hold. Slowly, agonizingly, a wall began to rise. A foundation of the largest, flattest stones she could move. Then, a superstructure of logs, saddle-notched with her axe and saw. She filled the gaps between the logs with smaller stones and packed them tight with her homemade mortar, a process called chinking. Her fingers, raw and clumsy, became adept at forcing the gritty mixture into every crack, sealing her home against the wind. Each completed section was a victory. The first wall, waist-high. The first fire, built in a carefully constructed hearth against the solid back wall of the alcove. The smoke found its way up a natural fissure in the rock, a hidden chimney she had discovered by watching where the morning mist curled. She built interconnected systems, born of necessity. The water seep was her first priority. She spent a week digging a shallow basin at the base of the rock, a cistern, and meticulously lined it with a thick layer of clay, packing it down until it was watertight. The slow, steady drip, drip, drip of the seep began to fill it. Within days, she had a reservoir of fresh, cold water inside her shelter, safe from the freezing winds to come. For food, she knew she could not rely on hunting. She was not a hunter. But she was a gardener. She identified the area just outside her new wall, a space that caught the full arc of the low winter sun, protected from the north wind by the towering cliff. Over 2 grueling weeks, she hauled buckets of rich black soil down from the woods on a crude sledge she'd fashioned. She created 3 long raised beds against the sun-warmed limestone, a microclimate that was a few precious degrees warmer than the surrounding land. There, she planted her winter rye and a few hardy greens she'd brought the seeds for. It was a desperate gamble against the coming frost. 3 weeks into her labor, she knew she needed more. She needed a source of protein that could survive with her. With her calloused hands and aching back, she made the long walk back to Providence. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, her face etched with new lines, her clothes stained with dirt and lime, but her eyes held a new, hard light. She walked into Finch's Mercantile, the 2 quarters from her pocket laid on the counter. "Henry," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, "I have 50 cents. I need 2 laying hens and a nanny goat and kid. I will work off the rest." Finch looked at her, at the raw strength in her hands, the utter lack of self-pity in her gaze. The mockery he had felt before curdled into something like awe. He sold her the animals for 50 cents and a promise of a dozen eggs in the spring, if she had them. As she was leading her small, noisy flock out of town, she saw her son, Thomas. He stood across the street, his face pale. He saw her, saw the goat and the chickens, and a look of deep, profound shame crossed his features before he turned and hurried away. The journey back was even harder, coaxing the stubborn goat and carrying the squawking chickens. But when she arrived, her small domain felt different. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a homestead. She built a small, sturdy lean-to for the animals against the main wall, where the radiated warmth from her hearth would help keep them from freezing. Throughout it all, Barrow was her shadow. He lay by the fire at night, his warm body a comfort against the deep chill. He stood guard while she worked, his low growl alerting her to the passing of a coyote or a curious deer. He watched her every move with his soulful brown eyes, a silent, unwavering testament to loyalty. In the crushing solitude of the quarry, his presence was the one thing that kept the loneliness from becoming a madness. He was her family, her guardian, her only friend. She was building a world for two. The story of Elspeth and her quarry spread through Providence like milkweed fluff on the wind. It became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale told over checkerboards and sewing circles. They gave her a name, the Quarry Witch. Her home was Elspeth's Folly. The consensus was that she was mad, driven to it by grief and destitution. They imagined her huddled in a damp cave, gnawing on roots, a wild creature waiting for the winter to claim her. The humor was cruel, a way for the town to distance themselves from the uncomfortable truth of what they had allowed to happen. Sheriff Gable was the most vocal of the mockers. He represented the town's official conscience, and his dismissal of Elspeth absolved them all. One afternoon in late November, he rode his horse out to the quarry, ostensibly on a mission of welfare. He found Elspeth splitting firewood, her movements economical and strong. The axe rose and fell with a steady, practiced rhythm. He took in the scene, the solid wall of stone and log, the wisp of smoke curling from the cliff face, the neat stack of wood, the sound of a goat bleating from its enclosure. It was not the scene of squalor and despair he had expected. "A hard winter's coming, Elspeth," he said, his voice carrying an unwelcome note of condescension. He stayed on his horse, looking down at her. "No shame in the poorhouse. We can find you a warm bed." Elspeth finished her swing, splitting a log cleanly in two. She did not look up at him. "I have a warm bed, Sheriff," she said, her voice flat. "And I have my work." He saw the calluses on her hands, the determined set of her jaw. He was offering her pity, and she was rejecting it with quiet dignity. It angered him. "This is no place for a woman your age. This hole will be your tomb when the snows come." He turned his horse and rode away, the encounter only hardening his conviction that she was a fool. His report to the town was simple. She was alive, but she was doomed. As autumn bled into winter, Elspeth's world shrank to the rhythms of the quarry. The first snows came, dusting the gray rock with a layer of pristine white. Her life became a cycle of simple, essential tasks. At dawn, she would rise in the dark, the warmth of the stone wall a comfort at her back. She would stoke the fire, the heart of her world, adding the logs she had spent all autumn cutting and stacking. The deep stone hearth and the massive rock wall behind it had become a thermal battery. It drank the fire's heat all day and night and radiated a gentle, constant warmth that kept the small home at a steady, comfortable temperature, even when the fire burned low. Her days were measured and purposeful. She fed the chickens and the goat Beatrice. She collected the precious eggs, a miracle of life in the growing cold. She milked Beatrice, the warm, fresh milk a luxury she never took for granted. She tended her small garden, which, nestled against the sun-warmed southern wall, was still producing a few hardy greens, long after every garden in Providence was frozen solid. She checked her chinking, mixing small batches of mortar to seal any new cracks the frost had opened. She was utterly alone, but she was not idle. She was the sovereign of her own small kingdom, a world of warmth and order she had built with her own 2 hands. There were smaller tests before the great one. A mid-December thaw sent a river of meltwater cascading down the quarry walls. Her clay-lined cistern overflowed, but her shelter, built on the cleared, raised platform, remained perfectly dry. She dug a trench to divert the flow, her shovel ringing against the frozen ground. One night, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger, found their way into the quarry. Barrow's ferocious barking, amplified by the stone walls, held them at bay until Elspeth appeared in the doorway, holding a flaming brand from the fire. The wolves, confronted by the strange, echoing noise and the dancing light, retreated into the darkness. Each small victory solidified her confidence not in herself, but in the systems she had built. The quarry was not her tomb, it was her fortress. Then came the great storm. It was not a storm, it was a judgment. It arrived not with the gentle preamble of falling flakes, but as a physical blow from the north, a wall of white that erased the world. The people of Providence would later call it the blizzard of '83, a name spoken with a shudder for generations. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a solid, unceasing shriek that tore at roofs and shattered windows. It was a sound that scraped the soul raw. The temperature plummeted. It fell past 0, past 10 below, past 20. It reached depths no one in living memory had ever experienced. The air itself became a weapon, freezing lungs and turning exposed flesh to dead, white stone in minutes. Snow fell in a blinding, horizontal torrent, piling up in drifts that buried fences, then sheds, then entire outbuildings. The world outside became an alien landscape of roaring white and lethal cold. Inside her fortress of stone, Elspeth was an island of calm in a sea of chaos. The shriek of the wind was a dull, distant roar, muffled by 100 feet of solid rock. Her wall of log and mortared stone stood firm, shedding the wind like water. The snow piled up against it, not as a threat, but as another layer of insulation. The fire in her hearth burned steady and bright, its heat sinking deep into the limestone wall, which radiated a gentle, life-giving warmth throughout the small space. Her animals were safe and calm in their lean-to, sheltered from the storm's fury. The cistern, deep within the shelter, provided clean water that would not freeze. She had food, she had warmth, she had water. She was not fighting the storm, she was simply outside its reach. In Providence, the world was ending. The town's confidence, built on sturdy wooden frames and a century of predictable winters, shattered in a single night. The green, unseasoned wood most families burned was no match for the predatory cold. It smoldered and smoked, offering little heat. Chimneys, clogged with ice and snow, backed up, filling houses with blinding, choking smoke. The clapboard walls, which had always been enough, now seemed as thin as paper. The wind found every crack, every seam, pouring cold into homes like a flood. Livestock, even in the sturdiest barns, began to die, their bodies freezing solid in the stalls. The great windows of the meeting hall, the town's designated emergency shelter, exploded inward under the wind's relentless pressure, turning the sanctuary into a vortex of snow and ice. Roofs, groaning under the impossible weight of the snow, began to creak, then splinter, then collapse. Families huddled together in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive, listening to the storm try to tear their world apart. The town's preparations, their collective wisdom, had failed. They were trapped, and they were freezing. On the third day of the blizzard, a sound broke the quiet rhythm of Elspeth's shelter. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate scratching at her door, followed by a weak, muffled shout. Barrow erupted in a volley of deep, protective barks, standing bristling between Elspeth and the door. Elspeth quieted him with a hand on his back. No person could be out in this. No animal would be so foolish. She unbarred the heavy plank door and pulled it inward. A figure, a man so covered in ice and snow he was barely human, fell forward across her threshold and collapsed onto the stone floor. He was a specter of ice, his face a mask of frozen agony. Barrow sniffed at the man, then looked up at Elspeth, whining softly. The threat was gone. This was only a broken thing. Elspeth dragged the man closer to the fire. With practiced, methodical movements, she began the work of saving him. She cut away his frozen coat and boots with a skinning knife. His hands and feet were waxy and white. His breathing was a shallow, painful rasp. As she wiped the ice from his face, she recognized him. It was Daniel, Sheriff Gable's young deputy, the same young man who had stood silently behind the sheriff as she was evicted from her home. For a fleeting moment she felt a cold knot of bitter memory. This man was part of the world that had cast her out, left her for dead. Helping him would cost her. Her firewood, so carefully rationed. Her food stores, meant to last until spring, her own safety. She could close the door, let the storm have him, and no one would ever know. It would be a just, if silent, revenge. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The man on her floor was not an instrument of the law, not a symbol of the town's cruelty. He was a human being, and he was dying. Her choice was not about them or their judgment or her vindication. It was about who she was, and she was not a woman who let people freeze on her doorstep. She worked through the night, forcing warm broth between his cracked lips, rubbing his frozen limbs to restore circulation. Slowly, life flickered back into him. His breathing deepened, color returned to his cheeks. By morning he was conscious, his eyes wide with disbelief as he took in the impossible scene around him, the warm, dry room, the glowing hearth, the quiet sounds of the animals, the old woman who was supposed to be dead. "The town," he rasped, his voice raw, "the town is dying." He told her everything, of the collapsing roofs, the dwindling firewood, the families freezing in their homes. He had been sent to try and reach the next settlement for help, a suicidal mission that had failed within miles. He told her of Sheriff Gable, his own family trapped, his youngest child burning with fever in a house that was losing its battle with the cold. Elspeth listened, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she simply nodded. She went to her stores and began to pack a small hand sled she had built for hauling firewood. She loaded it with dry, seasoned pine and oak, wood that would catch fast and burn hot. She wrapped salted meat and hard bread in cloth. She filled a skin with fresh water from her cistern. She harnessed Barrow to the front of the sled, his strong body ready to help pull it through the drifts. The deputy watched her, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding of how wrong they had all been. He was weak, but he struggled to his feet. He would go with her. He owed her that much. Together, they opened the door and stepped out into the roaring white hell of the storm. The journey back to Providence was a battle for every foot. The wind was a physical force trying to tear them from the earth. The snow was a treacherous, shifting sea, hiding drifts that could swallow a man whole. The deputy, weak as he was, broke the trail, while Elspeth and Barrow fought to keep the sled from overturning. They were guided not by sight, for there was nothing to see but a wall of swirling white, but by Elspeth's deep-rooted knowledge of the land's contours. She navigated by the slope of the ground beneath her feet, the feel of the wind on her face. They reached the outskirts of town, and it was a graveyard, a place of unnatural silence broken only by the shriek of the wind. Houses were shapeless white mounds. They made their way to the sheriff's home. The front door was blocked by a massive drift, so they fought their way to the back. The door was unlocked. They stepped inside, and the cold was as bitter as it was outdoors. It was a house surrendering to death. In the main room, Sheriff Gable sat slumped in a chair, staring at a fireplace filled with gray, dead ash. He was wrapped in every blanket he owned, but he was shivering violently, a man hollowed out by cold and despair. His wife was huddled on the floor with their young daughter, the child's breathing shallow and rapid. The air smelled of failure. Then Elspeth walked in. She moved past Gable as if he were a piece of furniture, her face set and purposeful. She began clearing the old ash from the hearth, her movement swift and efficient. The deputy followed, his arms loaded with the precious dry wood. The sheriff looked up, and his mind, slow and numb with cold, struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. It was the Quarry witch, the foolish old woman, here, in his home, in the heart of the storm, bringing fire. As Elspeth skillfully laid the new fire, stacking the kindling and logs to ensure a fast, hot burn, Gable's wife looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. The deputy knelt by the child, feeling her forehead. The fever was high. Elspeth struck a match. The flame caught the tinder, licked at the kindling, and then roared to life, consuming the seasoned oak. A wave of heat, real, life-giving heat, began to push back the killing cold. The room filled with a golden, dancing light. It was the most beautiful thing Gable had ever seen. He stared at Elspeth, at her worn coat, her wind-burned face, her capable, calloused hands. He thought of his own words to her, his condescension, his certainty. "This hole will be your tomb," he had said. He had cast her out, and she had returned through the heart of an impossible storm to save him. The shame was so profound, it was a physical sickness, rising in his throat. He staggered to his feet. "Elspeth," he began, his voice a broken croak. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched, as if to a savior. I cast you out. We called you a fool." His voice cracked, and a tear froze on his cheek. "My God," he whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "We were the fools." Elspeth did not look at him. She did not offer a word of comfort or condemnation. Her victory was not in his admission. Her victory was in the fire, in the warmth, in the life she had carried through the storm. She turned to his wife. "There is broth," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Heat it for the child." She unpacked the food from her sled. She gave them what they needed to survive. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The roaring fire in the hearth set it for her. When the great blizzard finally broke, it revealed a world transformed. Providence was a town humbled, scarred, and profoundly changed. The stories that emerged from those terrible days were not of loss and death, though there had been plenty of both, but of survival and of the old woman who had walked out of the storm like a prophet. The tale of how she had saved the Gable family, bringing fire and food from her fortress of stone, spread from house to house, whispered in tones of disbelief and reverence. In the weeks that followed, a slow pilgrimage began. People made their way out to the quarry, not to mock, but to see. They came with offerings, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, a bolt of wool cloth, and with questions. They stood at the edge of the pit and stared down at the small, orderly homestead, nestled against the rock. They saw the sturdy wall, the wisp of smoke, the healthy animals, the impossible patch of green where her winter garden grew. It was not a folly, it was a masterpiece of common sense. Elspeth received them with a quiet, reserved grace. She traded eggs for sugar, milk for nails. She answered their questions about thermal mass, about wind breaks, about how to build a hearth that held its heat. The name Quarry Witch was retired, replaced with something simpler, more profound. They just called her Elspeth, her name now synonymous with a kind of wisdom the town had forgotten it needed. One day her son Thomas came. He stood at the top of the quarry path, a parcel of expensive goods in his hands. He looked down at the world his mother had built from nothing, and the comfortable life he had in town suddenly seemed brittle and false. He called her name, but she did not answer or emerge from her home. He waited for an hour in the cold before leaving the parcel at the head of the path and walking away, a man diminished by a strength he could never understand. Section S. The lessons of the blizzard of '83 were written into the town's very bones. New homes were built with stone foundations, their longest walls facing south. People began to build with the land, not against it. A well-built hearth, a dry wood pile, and a sheltered location became marks of true wealth, more valuable than a wide porch or a fancy parlor. Quarry built became a local phrase, a term of high praise for anything made to last. Elspeth's folly had become Elspeth's wisdom, and her story traveled with merchants and trappers to other towns, a legend of the frontier. Years passed. Elspeth remained in her quarry, a quiet fixture of the landscape. She grew old, her movements slower, her face a beautiful map of her long and arduous life. She never returned to Providence, but the world, in a way, came to her. On a warm evening in late spring, Elspeth, now well into her 80s, sat on a smooth stone bench outside her home. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Her goat's descendants grazed peacefully nearby. Barrow was long gone, buried with honor beneath a lone pine, but a new dog, just as loyal, lay at her feet. The quarry walls, which had once seemed like a prison, now felt like a protective embrace. They held the day's warmth, radiating it back to her as the sun dipped below the hills. She had been given a worthless hole in the ground, a place of shadow and rock. From it, she had built not just a shelter, but a life. She had discovered that the greatest strength is not found in what you own or where you live, but in the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. True sanctuary was not a house with four walls, but the unyielding fortress you build inside yourself.